hot afternoon descended on a small village lurking on the borders of the Kenyan savannah. The dim light of the sun spread lazily over the ground. Vapors rose from the hot stones, rippling the air over the dusty paths. Layla stood on the threshold of her hut and looked into the distance, where the tops of the acacias were slightly moving under the light gusts of wind. Her eyes were thoughtful, like those of a person who has long lost something important in life. Layla's marriage to Jamal began with a passionate passion. Then it seemed that their love would be able to survive any trials. Neither Savati nor tedious daily worries could shake their unity. But time inexorably smoothed out the sharp edges of the relationship, turning everything into a grey routine. Jamal's work took up almost all of his time. He left for the fields before dawn and returned only in the evening, exhausted and quiet. Layla tried to keep the fire of love burning in their house, but no matter how hard she tried, their passion remained only a dim light, barely glimmering under the mountain of remote duties and daily chores. Today was another day when Layla spent it alone. Her little manual tasks have long ceased to be fun. She was rushing around the house, trying to find something to do. Sometimes she took up cooking, then cleaning, then went out into the yard and watched the wind drive the dust along the paths. But everything seemed unnecessary and boring. Layla felt a growing anxiety inside her, a strange feeling that life was passing by, leaving nothing but fatigue behind. Her gaze skimmed the horizon, where in the distance the green patches of banana plantations could be seen, behind which the river was hidden. There, behind the trees, was the house of a neighbor, Moses. She couldn't help but think about him more and often these days. Moses lived alone, took care of his household, was a strong and charismatic man. Unlike Jamal, his presence was always noticeable when he appeared in the village. His confidence and energy dominated the surrounding space. He never went unnoticed. His conversations were filled with life and some kind of sincere, tireless interest in the world around him. Layla sighed and turned away from the doorway, walking back into the hut. She felt guilty for her thoughts about her neighbor, even though nothing had happened yet. But for some reason, every time Jamal was around, it became more and more difficult for her to hide this inner tension. Her husband was a kind man, she knew that, but over time his kindness began to seem commonplace to her, as if it were a necessary part of everyday life, like water or food. She couldn't remember the last time they had talked to each other about something important, personal. Their conversations boiled down to an exchange of necessary phrases about the household, children, and plans for the coming days. There was no passion left in their relationship. There was no more fire. Layla sat down on a mat in the middle of the hut and leaned her back against the cool clay wall. Her eyes stared into the void again, and her thoughts, like black crows, circled in her head, giving her no rest. More and more often she found herself thinking about living with someone else, about a life in which there would not be this suffocating routine, in which she would feel alive, desired. She knew these were dangerous thoughts, but she couldn't handle them. Footsteps outside interrupted her thoughts. Layla sat up abruptly, listening. Someone was approaching the house. Confident footsteps were approaching her doorstep. She recognized these steps. Moses. Her heart began to beat faster, and a vague anxiety mixed with curiosity appeared in her chest.
Layla, are you at home?
His voice was low, slightly hoarse, and it sounded soft, but with that special strength that always made her shudder.
Yes, I'm here,
she replied, feeling her hands tremble, although she couldn't figure out why. After all, it was only Moses, her neighbor. He often helped them with household chores, and his visit should not have caused any unusual feelings. But her heart continued to beat too fast. Moses entered the hut, tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to bear the weight of the land. He was dressed simply, in a weathered shirt and loose trousers, but his gaze, confident and direct, seemed to penetrate into the very soul. He looked at Layla with a slight smile that usually softened his features, making him more welcoming.
Is Jamal not at home? What is it?
He asked, looking around.
No, he's in the fields.
Layla replied, avoiding his gaze. She felt her cheeks begin to burn, although she tried to remain calm. Moses nodded, coming closer. There was such confidence in his movements, as if the whole world was under his control. Layla always felt a little uncomfortable around him. But this discomfort was not something that scares, but rather something that excites and makes her heart beat faster.
I came to see if you needed any help.
He continued, sitting down on a wooden chair opposite her. You've been looking tired lately. Everything is fine. Layla hesitated for a moment, feeling his words penetrate deeper than she would like to admit. Yes, she was tired. She was tired of this monotony, of the constant care of the house, of the lack of something that could give her a sense of life. But could she tell him that?
It's okay.
She lied, forcing a smile. It's just a lot of work. Moses looked at her, his eyes dark and deep, never leaving her face. There was something in that look that let her forget about time, about place, about her own home. Suddenly she felt as if everything around her ceased to exist except Mr., as if only the two of them were left in this hot, musty air. Moses leaned forward slightly, and his voice became quieter, almost a whisper.
You know, Layla, sometimes work is not the main thing. Sometimes you need to stop and think about what is really important. Have you ever thought about it?
Her heart leapt again. She understood that these words were more than just friendly advice. There was something about them that drew her to him, like an invisible force. Layla was silent, not knowing how to answer. Thoughts and images flashed through her mind, but none of them could express what she felt. Moses continued to look at her. His face was calm, but there was a spark in his eyes that she hadn't noticed before. Outside, the wind picked up, kicking up dust and dry leaves that swirled in the air like the embodiment of her own chaotic feelings. Layla sat there, trying to keep control of herself, but she felt that this moment was changing something important inside her. Something that couldn't be stopped. The hot sun was sinking below the horizon, leaving behind red-hot sand and slowly cooling air. Layla continued to sit on the mat, still feeling the inner tension from her recent conversation with Moses. His words seemed to leave a slight echo in her soul that did not want to dissolve. He left as quietly as he had come, but his presence still hung in the air like an invisible trail. She stood on the threshold of her hut, gazing thoughtfully into the distance, as if trying to see something beyond this sunset, beyond the world she knew. Everything around her suddenly seemed too mundane, too small. This day was like many others, but something has changed in it. Maybe it wasn't the day itself, but her. The next morning, Jamal went back to the fields. Layla was left alone, surrounded by familiar worries, which, however, seemed increasingly alien to her. The day dragged on slowly, and all her actions seemed to happen by inertia. She mechanically cooked food, cleaned the house, checked water supplies. But deep down, all this had long since ceased to interest her. Soon there were footsteps, so confident and familiar again. Layla froze for a moment, listening. Her heart started beating faster again, but this time she was already expecting this arrival. Her inner world stirred up again, and she realized that now she had been waiting for this. Part of her wanted to hear Moses talk to her again, how he would invade her life again, bringing this strange feeling with him, a feeling that mixed fear and excitement.
Layla? Layla.
His voice is back, a little hoarse, but still calm. She turned around, this time confidently, feeling that this time she would not avoid his gaze. Moses was standing at the gate of her yard, with a shovel on his shoulder. The sun broke through the trees, falling on his shoulders, emphasizing his muscular figure.
You're here again.
Layla said with a slight smile, although there was more surprise than irony in her voice.
I thought you might need a couple extra hands.
Moses replied, stepping closer to her. There were no hints or hidden subtexts in his voice. It seemed that he came just as a neighbor, as always, ready to help with the housework. But Layla felt that this was not just an ordinary visit. Every time he appeared, he felt an elusive atmosphere thickening around them, which was difficult to describe in words.
There's not a lot of work here,
she replied, although deep down she knew she was saying it more for herself than for him. But Moses was persistent. He entered the yard, leaning on a shovel, and looked around the small garden behind the hut, where work had recently begun on preparing the land for a new harvest.
I see you're up to something serious,
he remarked, nodding toward the unkempt beds. Layla shrugged, feeling his attention begin to enter her thoughts again. She was used to being alone, used to doing her own work, but now that he was standing next to her, his physical presence seemed too real, too tangible.
Jamal helped me, but he doesn't have time to do it,
she finally said, avoiding his gaze, looking at the cracked ground under her feet.
I thought I could handle it on my own.
Let me help you,
he offered, stepping closer. Layla didn't object. Two forces were fighting inside her. One was trying to keep her distance, not to let anything change. The other, a new, almost unfamiliar one, was pulling her towards him, forcing her to give in to his offer. She nodded, silently agreeing to his help. Moses took off his shirt and set to work, plunging the shovel into the hard, almost scorched earth. Layla followed his movements, but her thoughts were far away. With each of his strokes on the ground, tension grew inside her, as if this work they were now doing together connected them more than just being next door. She also picked up the tools, but her actions were slow, as if every step was given to her with effort. At that moment she realized that she was not afraid of the job itself, but of what would happen if she allowed herself to get too close to him. Although at first glance nothing unusual was happening, they were just working in the garden, as any neighbors could do, but their every look, every casual gesture or word acquired a new meaning. Time passed slowly, but the tension between them grew. The sun continued to burn, their hands worked in a rhythm dictated by nature, but inside Layla there was an internal struggle. She felt an invisible but powerful force forming around them, pulling them towards each other. It was as if the land they cultivated had become a symbol of something new that was emerging between them. Moses threw the shovel aside and wiped the sweat from his forehead. His gaze settled on Layla again, and at that moment her whole body seemed to freeze, despite the heat. She avoided his gaze again, feeling her breathing quicken.
Layla,
He said softly, leaning toward her again.
you think so much. Sometimes you just have to let go.
His words, as before, were simple, but there was a hidden subtext in them again. She knew he wasn't talking about work. Moses had always been a man of action, and now, looking at her, he seemed to let her know that he saw her fears, her doubts, her inner torments. He knew there was a storm inside her, but he was willing to wait for her to decide what to do next. Layla took a step back, feeling that she couldn't stay so close to him anymore. She wanted to say something, to find the right words, but instead silence became her salvation. They stood opposite each other, as if facing an invisible line that neither of them had dared to cross yet.
I need to finish my lunch.
She said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice sounded too harsh, but it was all she could think of to break the moment. Moses nodded, letting her go as easily as he had come. He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. But Layla knew that this was just a temporary retreat. Every time they were together, this intense bond intensified, and it became impossible to ignore it. He left and silence filled her house again. Layla felt her heart still beating faster than it should. Moses was not just a neighbor, he became a part of her inner world, invading the routine of her life in a way she did not expect. Now each of his visits was not just a friendly help, but something much more than she could admit to herself. She was sitting at the table in her hut, looking at her hands, which were still shaking. There was no clarity in her thoughts. Layla understood that her life, her familiar world, was bursting at the seams, but she did not know how to stop it. Or maybe she didn't want to. After all, Moses was the one who reminded her that she was still alive. His presence revived in her the passion that had long since died out in her marriage to Jamal. But it was wrong, and Layla knew it. She knew she shouldn't think about him, shouldn't let those thoughts take over her mind. But the more she tried to forget, the stronger that desire became. The day came to an end, and with it ended her brief respite from thinking about Moses. When night fell, Layla felt the silence surrounding her again, but this silence was full of tension. She couldn't get rid of the images that were forming in her head. She couldn't forget his confident steps, his strong hands, his gaze that seemed to read her mind. Moses invaded her life like a storm that destroys everything in its path, and Layla knew that this was just the beginning. The onset of a tropical evening brought with it some relief from the heat of the day, but this relief was superficial. The air was still thick, sticky, like a viscous syrup that made it difficult to breathe. Layla sat at the door of her hut, watching the crimson sunset slowly fade into blue and purple tones over the savannah. She seemed to be waiting, although she did not fully understand what she was waiting for. It had been several days since Moses had last visited her, helping with the housework. Time seemed to slow down, and every day dragged on for an excruciatingly long time. Jamal, her husband, was busy with his business in the fields again. His presence in the house was becoming more and more rare and unnoticeable. He returned late, barely had time to eat, and immediately went to bed. Their conversations became even shorter than before. Each of his answers sounded dry, mechanical, as if he was just repeating memorized phrases to fill in the pause. Layla almost stopped noticing him. But she couldn't stop thinking about Moses. They were intrusive, sneaking into her mind at the most unexpected moments. She tried to deal with it, convinced herself that it was just a fantasy, that nothing was happening. But no matter how hard she tried, the image of his strong hands, confident movements, his attentive gaze returned again and again. The internal tension was building up every day, like a storm that was ready to hit at any moment. Today's sunset was especially beautiful, and its colors were reflected in Layla's eyes, adding a certain softness and sadness to her face at the same time. She stood leaning against the wooden doorjamb, thinking about how her life had changed in recent years. Once she was sure that her love for Jamal would last forever, they made plans with him, dreamed of the future. But now those dreams seemed distant and blurred, like a mirage on the horizon. The reality she found herself in was harsher and more ruthless. Longing for lost feelings grew inside her, like an inevitable desire to regain something lost. And so, as if by the will of some unknown force, at that moment his footsteps broke the silence of the evening again. Layla knew the sound Moses' heavy but confident footsteps. Her heart stopped for a moment, and then began to pound in her chest, like the warning beat of a drum announcing something inevitable. She turned around. He stood in the shade of an acacia tree at the entrance to the courtyard, as if dissolved in the soft light of the passing day. His silhouette was clearly outlined, even in the gathering dusk. He was looking at her, and although there was enough distance between them, Layla felt his gaze pierce her. This was not the calm and friendly Moses she had known before. There was something more in that look, something primal, wild, as if nature itself transmitted its hidden desires through it.
Layla,
He said softly, coming closer.
I can't stay away for long. Something is pulling me towards you.
She didn't answer. The words stuck in my throat like a lump that couldn't be swallowed. She couldn't find the right words to express the storm of emotions that was raging inside her. Instead, she just stood there, watching Moses approach. He came closer, very close now, and there was no more space between them that could serve as a barrier. They stood face to face, and Layla felt her body begin to tremble. It wasn't the kind of shiver that comes from the cold, no. It was something else, a mixture of fear, excitement, and the realization that she was standing on the edge of a precipice from which there was no return. Moses held out his hand, his fingers barely touching her shoulder, but it was enough to make her breathing quicken. His touch was gentle, but there was a powerful force behind it that Layla couldn't fight. She knew she had to stop it, she had to turn away, she had to find the strength to leave. But her feet seemed rooted to the ground, and her gaze did not leave his face.
What do you want, Layla?
Moses asked softly, his voice deep and low, as if penetrating right into her soul. She knew the answer, but she was afraid to say it out loud. The fear of the inevitability of what was happening paralyzed her. But at that moment, desire was stronger than fear. It was so powerful that all her inner principles and moral foundations collapsed in front of this wave. She felt her body slowly responding to his proximity as her mind clouded, giving way to instincts. She began, but her voice betrayed her. The words wouldn't come. Inside her, everything was mixed into one tangle of emotions. But Moses didn't wait for an answer. He took a step forward and, without taking his eyes off her face, gently ran his hand over her shoulder, then down to her elbow. The touch, though barely noticeable, made Layla shudder. She could feel the warmth building inside her, like a fire burning up with every second. His fingers were warm, firm, and every moment she realized that resistance was becoming impossible. They stood there without saying a word, but there was more going on in that silence than words could express. Layla could feel the tension between them reaching a peak. It was so thick that it seemed you could touch it, like a thick cloth stretched between them. At that moment, the sunset went out completely, and the savannah was enveloped in complete darkness. The warmth of the day was slowly giving way to the coolness of the evening, but Layla did not feel it. Everything was boiling inside her, and this storm could not subside in any way.
You want this as much as I do.
Moses whispered, his breath burning her neck as he leaned closer. Her mind was clouded, her words lost their meaning. She couldn't say yes and she couldn't say no. It was the moment when reality ceased to exist. There were only the two of them, their bodies, their desires, their hidden passions that could no longer be controlled. Moses leaned even closer, and their lips almost touched. Layla felt his breath, hot and ragged, and at that moment she realized that this kiss would change everything. It was the decision from which there would be no turning back, the very moment that would divide her life into before and after. She closed her eyes, unable to resist any longer. Images of the past flashed through her mind, her life with Jamal, their children, their home. But these thoughts were distant and blurred, like shadows in a fog. The only thing that mattered now was the desire that had captured her completely. When their lips finally touched, everything else ceased to exist. This kiss was not just an act of physical intimacy. He was a symbol of everything that had accumulated inside her over the years: longing, disappointment, dissatisfaction. That kiss was a release, a moment when her suppressed desires burst out. Moses hugged her tightly, and she didn't resist. She knew that everything would be different now. She knew that this moment would change their lives forever. The darkness around them seemed to be a silent witness to their deed. Savannah, usually filled with the sounds of nightlife, seemed to freeze at this moment. Everything around them was plunged into silence, in this moment of temptation, when two souls who had lost their bearings found each other in this primeval night. The thick African night, which for a moment became their shelter, seemed to engulf them completely. The darkness was gathering around her, as if closing in a tight circle, depriving Layla of a sense of reality. She felt only Moses' touch, his warmth and strength, which at that moment completely subdued her will. It was like a dream, but this dream was surprisingly real, too real to escape or just wake up. The kiss lasted only a few seconds, but for Layla it was like an eternity in which she felt like a woman again, desirable and alive. Her body responded to this call, as if it had been waiting for such a moment for a long time. But along with this feeling of freedom came the realization that she was making a mistake, that she was crossing the line that separates her familiar world from the unknown. When Moses finally pulled away, silence fell between them. Layla was breathing heavily, her heart was pounding like crazy. At that moment she realized that she was on the edge, where it was no longer possible to just take a step back and forget everything. Her lips could still feel Moses' touch, his warmth, but her mind was alarmed, reminding her of what was at stake.
Layla.
Moses' voice sounded low, as if breaking this fragile moment. She didn't answer. A real storm started inside her. Her mind was racing between desire and duty, between what she was feeling at that moment and what she needed. The air around her seemed to thicken and become heavy, like her own thoughts, like unresolved questions that suddenly piled up with all their weight. She took a step back, pulling away from him, her gaze uncertain. What has she done? She couldn't give herself an answer to that question. Her body still craved his closeness, but her mind demanded to stop, to think. But how can you think when so many emotions are raging inside? Moses looked at her, his eyes still full of desire, but he didn't take any more steps forward. He gave her time, allowing her to make a choice. Layla understood that this was the moment when everything was being decided. Either she will leave everything as it is and leave, or she will finally succumb to her feelings, stepping over the line that has held her back for so long. She turned away and took a few steps towards the hut. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was pounding as if it was about to burst out of her chest. Moses did not follow her, did not hold her back. He stood watching her as she floundered between her desires and her duty. Layla knew that if she just went inside now, she might be able to keep the situation under control. She will be able to hide from this obsession, return to her old life, to Jamal, to usual duties. But along with this realization came another, a terrible realization that something had changed inside her for a long time. That this night had only split her apart, showing how long she had lived in a cage of her own fears and ordinariness. Her steps slowed down. Thoughts were mixing in my head, turning into one chaotic stream. She could hear the blood pounding in her temples, and it seemed to beat an inexorable rhythm, pushing her towards the decision she was so afraid to make.
You have to stop.
An inner voice whispered, urging caution. But every second that voice became weaker, quieter. It was drowned out by something bigger, deeper, her own suppressed desires, which now awoke with renewed vigor. Layla stopped at the threshold of the hut, but did not go inside. She leaned her hands on the wooden frame of the door and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to concentrate, to find at least a glimmer of reason among this chaos of feelings. Everything inside her was tearing apart. She knew that if she entered the house now, she could lose this moment forever. And then what? Would she go back to her old life as if nothing had happened? Will she be able to feel the same longing and emptiness again that she has felt in recent years?
Layla,
Moses said again, softer this time, almost in a whisper, but his voice was imbued with the same indomitable power. She shuddered at his words as if he had touched her soul again. There was more to that voice than just desire. There was a call in him that she couldn't ignore. This call reminded her that she was still alive, that there was passion inside her, there was a fire that had been extinguished for so long by everyday worries and monotony. She opened her eyes and looked over her shoulder. Moses stood motionless, not taking any more steps. He was only a few steps away from her, but it seemed like there was a whole chasm between them, a chasm that could only be crossed by one decision.
I can't.
She whispered, but the words didn't have the determination she expected. It was more of a pathetic protest, an attempt to hold on to the remnants of her world, which was crumbling right in front of her eyes. Moses remained silent. He waited, patiently and calmly, like a hunter who already knows the outcome, but still gives his prey a chance to escape. He didn't rush her, didn't force her. He was just there, and his presence was enough for Layla to feel her defenses crumbling. Her gaze fell on the door of the hut again. Inside was her home, her familiar world. But what kind of world was it? Emptiness, routine, a marriage that has long lost its passion and warmth, a world where her heart no longer beats in unison with Jamal, where every morning begins with cold and indifferent looks. On the other hand, there was Moses, the man who awakened in her what she thought was forever lost. His confidence, his strength, and his desire to be with her made her feel alive. And although she knew that it was wrong, that this choice could destroy everything she had, she could no longer close her eyes to this truth. Layla took another step back without entering the hut, and then turned to face Moses. Her gaze was steady, even though the storm was still raging inside her. She didn't know if she could handle the consequences, but right now, the only thing that mattered was this moment. A moment when she was on the edge between what was right and what she really wanted. Moses stepped closer, and his hands gently touched her shoulders. This time Layla didn't pull away. She looked at him, her heart beating faster, but it was no longer fear, but something else. She knew she couldn't resist now. She knew that she had made her choice a long time ago. Her body responded to his touch, and she leaned forward, allowing herself to lose herself in this moment. Their lips met again, and this time Layla felt no doubt. Everything that happened between them was not just a physical attraction. It was something more. Something that turned her life upside down, forcing her to see the world through different eyes. The moment she finally gave into her feelings, Layla realized that there was no turning back anymore. This kiss was her final choice, her concession to her own desires, which now left no room for doubt. She felt her body responding to every touch of Moses, as a new fire burned inside her, a fire that could not be extinguished. The night enveloped him in its thick veil, hiding everything from prying eyes. The world around him seemed to have ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, Layla and Moses, in their own world, closed off from everyone, where there were no rules and obligations. Everything that had happened before ceased to matter. Only the passion remained, which now controlled them, leading them further along the path from which there is no return. The night enveloped them, as if nature itself had decided to hide their act from the world. Layla and Moses were engrossed in each other, at which point everything else ceased to exist. The savannah, usually filled with the sounds of nightlife, became silent, as if the earth itself was holding its breath, watching what was happening. Layla felt her body yielding to Moses' will, as a flame flared up inside her every second, which she could no longer control. Her thoughts, previously filled with fears, doubts and struggles, have now given way to something more primitive, deeper, wild. Her whole being responded to this call of nature, which she had suppressed for so long. It was as if she had fallen out of time. Minutes no longer matter. The past and the future have disappeared, and only one point remains: this moment. Layla plunged into this feeling so deeply that all her internal conflicts and contradictions were momentarily silenced. Her mind was no longer resisting, and this was her turning point, the moment when she finally let go of everything that had once held her back. Every touch of Moses seemed to her both liberating and overwhelming. She felt weak and strong at the same time. It was as if her body had been waiting for this moment for a long time, when it could wake up from years of sleep. With each passing second, she became more and more lost in this feeling, losing the boundaries between reality and her inner desires. At that moment, Layla realized that her resistance was only a weak attempt to save something long lost. She lied to herself, trying to convince herself that her marriage to Jamal could have been saved, that she could have returned the warmth and passion that once bound them. But now, immersed in this whirlwind of emotions and bodily sensations, she realized that it was only an illusion, that in fact her inner world had long been empty. Moses became for her the embodiment of that power that she could no longer resist. The darkness around them was thick and warm, like a silk blanket covering them from prying eyes. At that moment, Layla felt neither guilt nor shame. Her mind was turned off, and the emotions that were raging inside completely engulfed her. It was not so much an act of physical desire as the release she had been waiting for so long. Her body and mind finally found a balance in this moment, when all rules and norms ceased to exist. With every second, with every movement, she realized that there was no going back. This moment changed her forever. Everything that had happened before seemed distant and unreal, like a memory of someone else's life. Layla realized that she would no longer be able to return to the woman she had been before. Her world was now divided into before and after, and this turning point became the point of no return. She felt her body completely surrender to this new sensation. It wasn't just a desire, it was an immersion into something deeper, primal. At that moment, she felt her heart beating in unison with the pulse of nature itself, as her body became a part of something bigger than herself. It was as if she had merged with the earth, with the savannah surrounding her, with those forces that had always been hidden inside her, but which she had suppressed for so long. Layla felt her breath mingle with the breath of the night. There was no room for doubt in her mind anymore. Everything was too real, too strong. She couldn't run away from it anymore. This moment was inevitable, and now she has accepted it completely. But with that realization came the realization that her life would not be the same anymore. Layla knew that when dawn broke, her world would change forever. That everything she had built, her marriage to Jamal, their family, was now in danger of being destroyed. And although these thoughts seemed distant and unreal now, they still crept into her mind as a reminder that this night has its price. The moment of temptation turned into the moment of realization that she had already made her choice. Layla now understood that her soul and body no longer belonged to her past. She was a different woman now, a woman who had overstepped her moral bounds and succumbed to her deepest desires. Her mind was going back to Jamal. His image flashed before her eyes like a dim shadow that no longer had the power over her that it had before. Layla knew that she had betrayed him, but now this fact did not cause her the feelings she expected. Instead of guilt or shame, she felt only the bitterness that her life with him was just an empty shell, without a real connection, without the fire that she now felt with Moses. And so, when their bodies found their unity, when the moment of passion reached its peak, Layla felt something new awaken in her soul. It wasn't just a release from the mundane, it was the realization that she had finally allowed herself to live the way she had always wanted. This turning point was her personal victory over fear, over the life that bound her. But with that realization came a cold clarity. When their bodies cooled from the heat of passion, when the night was filled with the sounds of savannah again, Layla felt reality begin to return. She lay staring into the darkness, listening to the sound of the wind and the distant cries of nocturnal animals. Moses was there, but now his presence no longer roused the same emotions in her that it had before. Instead, a new feeling began to arise in her soul: anxiety. This anxiety was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it had already begun to penetrate her consciousness. Layla knew that her act would not go unnoticed. She understood that the morning light would open up a new reality for her, in which she would have to live with the consequences of her decision. Savannah was breathing her nightlife again. The wind gently stirred the tall grass, rustling like the whisper of ancient spirits. Layla looked into this darkness and realized that her world had changed. That now, even if she wanted to return to her old life, it would be impossible to do so. The turning point had come, and with it came the realization that her choice was final. Layla was different now. She couldn't turn back time, couldn't erase the moment when she let her desires come out. This turning point became a new starting point in her life. She could feel the cold slowly creeping under her skin, despite the hot night air. It wasn't a physical chill, but a feeling that reality had finally caught up with her. When the passion subsided, when the heated energy that had been circling around them for the past hours began to dissipate, an emptiness appeared in Leela's soul. This was not the release she had expected. It was something else, the weight of the fact that she had made a decision that would change not only her life, but the lives of everyone around her. Her thoughts returned to Jamal. No matter how hard she tried to convince herself that their relationship had long since faded, the thought that she had betrayed him would not let go. Layla closed her eyes, trying to hold on to that sweet moment of passion that had just happened, but her mind no longer allowed her to immerse herself in memories. Everything that was happening reminded her that she would not be able to return to the old Layla, a woman who lived within the framework of her duties, who believed in family values despite their fading. Moses was lying next to him. His breathing was even, like a man who had achieved what he wanted. Layla could hear that breathing, but it didn't calm her down like it used to. Now that their intimacy had become a reality, not a fantasy, she realized that no amount of passion could drown out the anxiety that was growing inside. Moses was part of her new world, but this world was not yet fully understood by herself. She slowly sat up, looking around as if trying to find answers to her questions in the darkness of the savannah. The wind played with her hair, bringing the scent of dry earth and distant grasses. The night no longer seemed like a place to hide from herself. Now this night had become cold and hostile, like a new world that was just opening up before her. Layla realized that she would have to live with this decision. She betrayed her husband, overstepped her moral bounds, but what now, Zban? How will she live on? What would she say to Jamal? Or would she keep it a secret, trying to get on with her old life as if nothing had happened? She knew that none of these decisions would bring her relief. The mystery will weigh on her soul, destroy her from the inside, like a poison that slowly but inexorably poisons everything around. But if she decides to tell, what will happen then? Will this destroy her marriage completely? Will she destroy everything she and Jamal have been building for years? Layla ran her hand over her face, trying to erase the fatigue that suddenly overwhelmed her. She was on edge, and now she had to make a new decision, a decision that was much more difficult than the one she had made last night. Her inner world had been shattered, and now she had to put it back together piece by piece. But what would he be like now? Will there be a place in it for Jamal, for her family, for life as she has led up to this point? Or will she have to start all over again, building something new on the ruins of the old one? She looked back at Moses, at his calm face illuminated by the faint moonlight. He was the embodiment of the power she had succumbed to, and now she couldn't tell for sure if that power was destructive or liberating. Layla stood up, feeling her legs tremble with tension and fatigue. She stepped out the door, feeling the coolness of the night air on her heated skin. The savannah spread out before her seemed endless, like her own doubts and questions. The night seemed empty, but at the same time filled with something unknown. She knew her life wouldn't be the same anymore. It was her turning point, the moment when she let go of her old fears and beliefs, but at the same time she let go of the Layla she used to be. Now she had to face a new reality, and whatever she chose, this decision would change her life forever. The morning came quietly and inexorably, as always. Layla woke up early, although the sleep was fitful and did not bring any relief. Through the pale shadows of dawn, she felt that the new reality she had entered at night had already fallen on her with a weight that she could not ignore. The cool morning breeze glided over her skin, but even this freshness did not bring relief from the internal heat that burned her from the inside. Lying in bed, she tried to collect her thoughts. My head was spinning with a whirlwind of questions that had no answers. Her body still remembered Moses' nocturnal touch, but now that memory seemed distant and vague. The passion was gone, leaving behind a heavy realization, the realization that this night had changed everything. What had happened couldn't be undone, no matter how much she wanted it. Moses had already left. His footsteps had not woken her up. He left her alone in the hut, where the smell of night and someone else's passion still lingered. It seemed that nature itself had left an imprint on the walls, on the furniture, on the bed, where just a few hours ago they had become one. But now, with the coming of morning, all the magic has disappeared, leaving behind only silence and a heavy feeling of emptiness. Layla got out of bed, feeling her legs tremble with fatigue and nervous tension. She dressed slowly, avoiding looking at herself in the mirror, She knew that she would see someone else's face there, the face of a woman she would no longer recognize. Layla, who existed before that night, died with the last rays of the moon. Now there was a new woman standing in front of her, a woman who had broken all the rules, all the vows that had once seemed sacred. Her house looked the same, small, cozy, with the familiar details of everyday life that always comforted her. But now it all seemed somehow alien. Even her own hut had ceased to be a shelter. There was a shadow of betrayal lurking in every corner, a reminder that her actions had changed this familiar environment forever. Everything, every object was now steeped in her mystery. Layla went outside, breathing in the cool morning air. The savanna in front of her stretched out like an endless carpet of grasses gently swayed by the wind. Nature lived her life as always, indifferent to human actions and dramas. The birds woke up with the first rays of the sun, chirping, unaware of the weight that now lay on her heart. She took a few steps along the dusty path that led from her hut to the plantations. Jamal was supposed to be back from work today, and the thought of him coming back made Layla feel dizzy. How could she look into his eyes? How to explain the abyss that now separated them? Her body had betrayed him, her heart had betrayed him, and even though Moses was no longer here, his presence was still felt in her every move, in every breath. She knew she couldn't hide it. Even if she doesn't tell anyone about what happened, her inner world has been destroyed. A secret would always stand between her and Jamal. She could no longer be the woman she had been up to this point. How could she pretend that everything was okay? Jamal deserved the truth, but that truth could destroy him just as it was destroying her now. Her steps became slow and cautious. Every movement felt heavy to her, as if the ground beneath her feet no longer supported her. Her thoughts were disordered, like chaos after a storm, and she felt like she couldn't handle it alone. But who could she ask for help? Who could understand her pain, her despair? Layla knew that no one would be able to lift this burden from her. No one would understand her suffering, because she had made this choice herself. The silence of nature, which usually calmed her, now seemed overwhelming to her. Layla felt anxiety building inside her, as her mind began to crack at the seams under the weight of secrets and lies. But what happened next? How to live with it? What was she supposed to do? The questions tore her apart, giving her no peace. She stopped by the river, its water flowing slowly, reflecting the light of the morning sun. This place has always been her quiet refuge, where she came to think, to calm herself. But today, even the river did not bring relief. Her mind was still full of that night, full of images of Moses, his touch, his breath. Layla knew that this moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Her body was tired, exhausted not so much physically as emotionally. She sat down on the shore, feeling the cool earth beneath her calm her down a little. The water flowed slowly, like her own time, which seemed frozen in this agonizing moment. Layla was looking at the water, but she didn't see it. Her mind wandered through her memories, going back to the night when everything had changed. Once again, the inescapable truth stood before her. Her act could no longer be forgotten or erased from memory. Layla knew that there were grave consequences ahead. No matter how hard she tried to avoid them, her choice was made, and now it will influence her every action, her every step. She changed her life, Jamal's life, and maybe even Moses' life. Nothing will be the same anymore. She was thinking about what would happen when Jamal found out. Would it ruin their marriage? Would he be able to forgive her if he found out the truth? Or will she keep this secret, living with him day after day, hoping that over time it will disappear from her memory? But Layla knew that it didn't happen that way. Secrets don't disappear. They live inside, corroding the soul, destroying all remnants of honesty and love. Despair was breaking through her thoughts. It seemed to her that she was stuck in a cage of her own decisions, seeing no way out. Every choice she made seemed wrong to her. To leave everything as it is means to betray yourself and Jamal. To tell the truth is to destroy everything that they have been building for years. She closed her eyes, hoping for a brief relief, but even that didn't help. The images of Moses came back to her, and with them came the realization that he too was part of these consequences. Layla understood that their connection could not just be forgotten, that she would no longer be able to look at him as a neighbor. Now there was an unbreakable thread between them that could not be broken. Maybe Moses didn't feel the same effects as she did. Perhaps for him it was just a moment of passion which did not carry with it the emotions that Layla was experiencing. But it was a disaster to her. She destroyed her own world, not knowing how to restore it. The water in the river continued to move, as if telling her that life was moving forward, despite all her mistakes and sufferings. Layla looked at this current, trying to find meaning in it, but all she saw was her own reflection, distorted and hazy, like her inner world. She sat there for a long time, not knowing how to find a way out of this maze of her own feelings. One thing was spinning in her head: the consequences of her action were inevitable, and she would have to live with them. Every morning, every day, every evening, her life won't be the same anymore. This choice made during the night had become her destiny, and now she could only accept her for who she was. Savannah was waking up around her. Life was going on, but for Layla, this life was different now. She stood up, feeling the weight of her legs, the weight of her own heart. Her house was waiting for her. Jamal was waiting for her. And a new reality was waiting for her, in which there was no place for old illusions.